Okay, so we're gathering, I hope, for the third session. We've got an hour and a half to cover a lot of ground, and we have a mix. So opening with Wendy, then to reflections from practitioners, then a central section with three great contributors to thinking about architecture, and finally two more practitioners. So it's a very thick club sandwich. But let's start with Wendy, if we may. And I'm just very much aware of time, so if the speakers could keep to between 5 and 10 minutes, that would be terrifically appreciated. Obviously, if there's something burningly important, carry on to 15, but just be aware it reduces the dialogue or potential for dialogue at the end. Thank you.
Okay. I think that, yeah, the discussion at the end is important, so we'll try and do that. Okay. All right, I'm actually just going to summarize the piece that I wrote and that is on the website, which I called Communicative Space: Architecture's Contribution. And like many of us here, I'm very interested in Dalibor's idea of communicative space. But one of the things that I realized is that certainly in commentary, Dalibor is regularly pitted up against the sciences and technology, and very rarely in terms of the social sciences. And because a lot of the work that I've done for close to 15 years now has been with social scientists, I'm really interested in what that relationship is. And I should probably say that in some ways I've done a full circle. I've been trained as an architect, working in the history and philosophy of architecture, moving into sociology, politics, geography in various ways, and learning a tremendous amount from the social scientists. I mean, I wouldn't want to deny how much I really have learned. And I have a very strong belief at this point that architecture must be much more attuned to the social sciences. And I do think that architecture in many, many ways is a political act, and I think we need to be aware of that. And I simply don't buy the story you get so often from architects who build in a bad place or a bad building or whatever, and then just say, well, what do I know about politics? I'm just a poor architect. And I'm sorry, that just will not do. We don't live in a world where that's possible as a viable statement anymore. So I do feel very strongly in the relationship between architecture and the social sciences. But at the same time, I think there really is a question of, well, what does architecture contribute to all this? I think architecture is changing in many ways as a discipline and as a profession. Certainly in our department here, we at this point are much more attuned to what you might call world issues. So problems and challenges that have to do with things like population density, migration, climate change, health issues, food security, conflict, which is my own field. I mean, these are all things that I think our students are increasingly aware of and increasingly interested in being involved with in one way or another. And we see this happening, of course, not just in the Cambridge Department of Architecture, but in a variety of different places, and as I say, in the profession as well. But I think that we can have a problem in that architects are not quite sure where to put themselves vis-a-vis the social sciences. I mean, one of the problems is the social sciences at least from an academic point of view, and they are, and that's a very important part of these disciplines, is that they're enormous, and they're very, very well established. And what we find today is that disciplines like sociology and geography have actually taken over the study of the city. I mean, they've taken it on as theirs. And at best, our architecture gets sort of included but sidelined, and at worst, architecture just simply gets ignored. I mean, I've actually had people ask, what does architecture have to do with cities? Sort of horrified and so on, but it's not well understood. Now, part of the problem is our fault that we don't communicate very well. I think that's a very big problem, is getting beyond the envelope of architecture and how do we talk to the other disciplines in a way that they will understand, but in a way that doesn't dismantle what it is what we do. The social sciences say that they're very interested in space. But I would say, as far as the social sciences are concerned, space is seen as something that's very vague, it's very abstract, and it's something that is based primarily on what we would call a horizontal level. It has to do with human beings interacting with each other, which is fine, but in a sense, everything that we've been talking about all morning here, that's the idea of embodiment and articulation, the relationships between them, the notion of vertical space is something that is missed almost completely by the social sciences. I think also the ability to observe well from the space itself, not through what people are saying to you, but actually from the spaces, is another aspect that the social sciences miss completely, that tend to be very, very adverse to description. And this is something that in architecture we do well, and certainly coming out of the phenomenology that many of us in this room are very attuned to. I mean, phenomenology is primarily a descriptive act, and we find that that's incredibly valuable. So, I mean, I think there are areas where architecture can contribute. I mean, I think very often we say, well, we're architects, so we design. Now, that's true, and Dalibor would be one of the first people to say that, yes, it all does happen in the design studio. And I think many of us do believe that. I mean, certainly the last session was a very good testament to that. But on the other hand, I think we're back to the problem of design being something that in a lot of ways is very much a reflective act. It has to do with being part of it. It has to do with being designing. And it's really difficult to convey that to other disciplines. And so in a sense, as wonderful as it is to see the world through design, we tend to cocoon ourselves. And that is simply very problematic. I think the other main reaction that has come out of architects in recent years is to try and beat the social scientists at their own game, to try and do social science. And that doesn't work terribly well at all in my experience. I think the last thing we want really is to be third-rate sociologists or geographers or whatever. I mean, this is something that certainly I tell my students on a regular basis. So the question is, all right, what can architecture contribute? And I would say one of the areas that we can contribute that is extremely valuable is in this idea of communicative space. And that's because we're not just looking at how you begin to mediate between different disciplines. I mean, I think that it is actually an ontological question. And so I think that we have to take the ontology into what we do and allow us to be able to, that will allow us to be able to communicate on that sort of level. And so the whole question then of what space is, which I've just intimated, and in terms of how we approach it, that it does need to be described. There is a detailed aspect to it. There is the relationship to what is more universal and what is more particular, and we're constantly negotiating that sort of question. I think the symbolism that comes out of the concrete experience is absolutely critical. I mean, this is something that Dalibor talked about a lot. We found very, very good examples in the buildings that he chose to work with in his book, and the combination of description, of working through the idea of a vertical structure to the world, to the different ontologies, and that the symbolism then arises out of that, and rises out of that concrete world, is something that we do almost naturally. I mean, certainly for everyone in this room, where we've come up through that tradition, I mean, I think it's a very profound part of the way we think, almost to the point where we really don't think about it. It's just something that we do. I mean, in my experience, we're able to use certain studio techniques in doing research, and that opens up new ideas and new ways of understanding situations. And that's coming very, very much from what I learned from Dalibor and from Peter, in terms of how one looks at this idea of a world. And a lot of what we're doing then is really putting back together that sense of world in order that we can understand it better, in order then to carry on the research. So, I mean, I think just basically to conclude then is to say that, and I'll quote Dalibor here, or as he says, only in symbolic articulation are we informed about the richness of events that take place in the depths of our human situation and experience. And that, I think, in a nutshell, then becomes what really can become architecture's contribution to this particular problem. And I think it's one of the ways that we can really begin to form and mold our relationship, certainly to other disciplines. I mean, I've been talking about the social sciences, and particularly the social sciences. I think it may work in other disciplines as well.
Thank you, Wendy. We've now got three presentations which are around the manifestation of ideas in architecture, starting with Biba Dao, who I'm very happy to say is not in absentia, but is here.
Thinking about the onerous task of trying to sum up Dalibor's teaching in 5 minutes, and I think it's partly to do, of course, with his enormous intellect and also with his great personal charm that had such an influence on everyone here. And what I've been trying to do is to think about how his teaching about architecture as a philosophical practice has been the basis for my practice with Alan and the projects we've done. And I'm going to talk about our first project and then things which we're doing at the moment as a way of thinking about his impact on our work. And I think the way we've done that has been primarily through an idea about material and construction, and the way that Dalibor always referred to architecture as being a practice that spoke across buildings and cities to shared cultural experiences, and how we could use materials as a way of making wider cultural and contextual representations of the work that we were doing. And I know that when we started our practice, we struggled to find a way of making something meaningful of the quite mundane projects that we were encountering. And what we tried to do was to use a way of talking about materials and thinking about materials and construction to do that. And this is one of our first projects, which is a new house in a Suffolk village near Orford. And it's a very bleak picture, and we took it before we realised that you had to photograph buildings after the spring. So there's no landscaping there, and it looks particularly grim. But what I enjoy about it is the way it represents this kind of bleakness of that landscape that we found ourselves working in. And we used a local brick, which has this very rich, reddy texture, to make a ground and a chimney on which to build a house that allowed us to make a material inhabitation of the ground in a place that was very featureless, both as a village and as a glacial moraine topography. So it was a way of making a place on which to embed our building. And there's an aspect of it which I enjoy about temporality as well, which makes me think about the way Dalibor spoke about conversations through time and space. That this building, this is a photograph we took in Dungeness, that the building we made in Suffolk might easily have been sort of wasted by time, and that what you would find afterwards was the placing of this ground and the chimney in the corner of the site. This is a project we've just finished at Christchurch, which again is about making a ground. And what we have done is to uncover Hawksmoor's space of the crypt of the church, which was a previously hidden space, and strip out all the detritus of walls that had accumulated within the space, and reconnect it to the life of the city through the material of the York stone, which is the material of the pavement of the city outside, and to make a very direct connection with through the material of the stone with the placing of Hawksmoor and Christchurch at the edge of the city. So its place outside the city walls, as is reflected in the iconography of the facade of the church. That's an early drawing we did exploring that. And we made a series of timber oak rooms inside, which mediate between the space of the city and the public space within the crypt. And they are the ordering devices. They make the spaces of inhabitation, and they refer to how Hawksmoor used oak elsewhere in the building to make these places for human interaction. This is a project on site at the moment, which is the extension to the Garden Museum, and the genesis of the museum is the tomb in the churchyard, it's in an old church, of John Tredescant, who was a plant gatherer and who brought the plane tree to Britain. And he also had an ark. We've talked a lot about arks today, but he had an ark that then became the beginning of the Ashmolean Museum. And part of the museum is about bringing back some of those artefacts and making a space for them within the new museum. And this was our study of making a screen wall and an architectural language out of a relationship with the plane trees outside. So through the sort of planar structure of the trees to make a screening, a way of screening that we've used both inside and externally. So our first project there was a cross-laminated timber structure which we're extending outside, and then we're going to clad it in bronze tiles which make a kind of skin over the timber, which again recall the kind of texture of the plane trees surrounding Tredescant's tomb, and resituate the museum around Tredescant and his influence on landscape and gardening. That's an arc and an axe over the project. And then lastly, a project we're doing in Bristol, which is extending a nursery, which sits between a medieval church tower and a 17th century merchant's house, which is lapped timber walls. And we're building a strip of building across the front of it, which the building extends into, but it makes a series of winter garden-like spaces which screen the building behind. And we often think about Peter's slide of a deer and a bush, and the bush revealing and concealing the deer. And we think of this as a kind of a cloaking screen that reveals the medieval building behind and makes a kind of glassy filigree structure in front of it. And so, lastly, just an idea about how what we're interested in is using as few materials as possible so that you're always aware of their presence, that the kind of power of the material is through a process of stripping away, so that you're aware of the impact, the quality of the material, and the role of construction within that as part of the space, so that it's trying to be as different as possible from a sort of architecture which is about being sort of self-reflective and about image, but about instead being about or using materials to be as embedded in a kind of wider cultural situation as possible.
Peter, thank you very much. I really enjoy this pace, I think, and I'm only sorry not to see your beautiful Paddington scheme, but that's for another day. Thank you. Patrick Lynch.
If I press that, it should. There we go. I didn't study design with Dalibor, but I studied architecture with Dalibor. This is brilliant, short guy. But Dalibor's book was called Architecture, it wasn't called Design, and I think he was slightly suspicious of modern design culture. This is the beginning of my papers about Dalibor's hands. We all know he was a musician. He had incredibly articulate hands and often to smoke. And these kind of, I was playing games sometimes, just watching the kind of shapes that he would make, and they would kind of dissolve. And there's some clue, I think, in this, which is one of the things I've taken from his work. That's two kind of slightly unrelated topics in architecture. The relationship between mimesis and communicative movement. And Dalibor keeps interrupting the book to talk about drawing and to talk about mimesis, but he doesn't really clarify in direct terms its relationship to modern design production. And that's because it, in his view, has been debased as imitation of typological references or imitation of nature. And yet, within his understanding of the capacity for communication to occur, he fundamentally grounds this experience in movement. What I'm kind of pondering on, and have been for a number of years, is the relationship between the kind of gesturing spatial territory that we kind of inhabit together, situations of dining together, more or less formal ritualistic situations, where we seem to know how to operate with decorum, and then how that scales up to the size of a room and the size of a city, which architects don't seem to be particularly good at, albeit I think Dalibor would caveat that you could be kind of good at architecture, but being good at city is a much more communal activity, a much more shared one. And in this talk that Dalibor gave in 1976 at the AA, he rather quizzically describes a visit with Richard Rogers to the Pompidou Centre, Beaubourg, and he says that there's something missing. The building is very impressive. It's very big. but there's something missing. And for a building that's supposed to represent culture and house it, it's somewhat invisible. And you can tell he's kind of slightly struggling to burst the myth of the AA, where he's talking, of which the Baroque is kind of the kind of apotheosis of the kind of archigram, insistence on an inevitable emergence of meaning from technology and public space. And he's kind of caught. I think he's trying to talk about what's almost unspeakable or unsayable. But nonetheless, there's a kind of an effort, an attempt being made to do this through a kind of theatricality of body gesture. And the thing that I think my work has been about of late is, well, what is this invisible territory that exists between the gesturing body, human situations, the human world of which we inhabit, and the kind of the problems that arise when architecture is too figurative or too gestural, and doesn't leave any space for spontaneity, for casual encounter. And I think ultimately this is a question of the reciprocity and the difficult relationship between embodiment and articulation, which ultimately Dalibor describes as having to do with silence. I think his way of dealing with this problem via drawing had an antecedent. Arguably the first architect, although he would probably not appreciate that phrase, was Il Divino in the various arts, the great poet, sculptor, painter, and architect, Michelangelo, who is one of the first people to start drawing human bodies on the same pages as he's drawing architecture. So what's curious here is you can see a hand turning a page, and you can also see a posture, a gesture. So there's a kind of relationship between imagining what it might be like to do something somewhere and imagining what it might look like, how it comes to appearance, how it is both embodied and is articulate of and intimating inhabitation. There's also a kind of silence. I think you can see there's a leg striding out of the portabilla. The architecture is this background. On the other hand, it is this kind of gesturing quality to it. It's not clothes, it's not just body, it's embodiment, which is not just corporeality or physicality. It's not just mute. His architecture of tombs, the thing that comes closely to clarity is the role of the sculpture can play. As Mari Vatum called it earlier, a more articulate other. My MPhil here with Dalibor was about a Festspielplatz in Dresden called the Swinger. It was a kind of tense, animated, yet attendant support structure for the life of the city. And these brackets of satyrs are there to support orange trees that were brought out during the summer months and otherwise were kept inside and cultivated. And so the kind of world that I got from Dalibor was this kind of sense that there's a depth structure. He used to talk about writing in terms of drawing because he knew I was an architect, and we would draw the kind of structure of arguments. And so one aspect of drawing, it's kind of a bit pat, but bear with me, is that drawings are a mode of hermeneutic investigation. They're a way of understanding and interpreting things that have gone before. Now that might be what we do anyway when we analyse a site, it's called mapping or presentation drawings, or I think also forms of participatory activity, consultation, dialogue, conversation, because we don't find the world in its original state, obviously, when we come across it. These are drawings of St. Peter's Klippan, part of my PhD with Joseph and Peter recently, and Helen Mallison, where this came out of an experience of using the church when I went to a Lutheran mass there and participated in it. And so you start to understand that within this kind of silent background of bricks, there's actually quite a lot of iconographic structure. There's no pictures in the Lutheran tradition, but there are sculptures and spatial settings which a kind of Sunday school writ large, lots of symbolic structure to it. Crucially, it's orchestrated by the movement of the sun from the east to the south, the midday moment of penetration of light hitting the altar, the raising of the Eucharist, the opening of the West Gate, the revelation of you there of a pond that literally brings the earth down to the sky. So this architectural gesture of the brick clouds is resonated at the moment of incarnation in this case. This is becoming another book, coming out in October. I've got to finish it by the 8th of May. Another book that I made recently, which draws on directly on Dalibor's work about mimesis, is that as well as there being this kind of immediate, physical, spontaneous, gestural aspect of creativity, there's also the memorial character of spatial situations and how they inspire what we're doing. But very simply, this is a building on the left. It's the Cadoro, a merchant's house on the Grand Canal in Venice. There's a water gate, a portico for water, and it's also south-facing. There's a deep threshold on the upper levels of the private parts of the building where the inhabitants could choose to be more or less in public, depending upon whether there was a festival on the water or more or less private. Obviously, the body occupied space in a slightly different way in those circumstances, but there's a relationship between light, between shadow and privacy, and also a kind of aqueous quality of glass. And this is a building, the top of the building. Just to say, I couldn't resist the use of onyx in this building, or a pattern of onyx, to variously deal with solar gain, deal with privacy, the screen. I couldn't resist putting it on the ceiling because, of course, in kind of hermeneutic exegesis, the relationship between embodiment and articulation requires a degree of wit, if not a kind of joke, that it's about the sky, how the clouds become this vaguely pictorial manifestation of themselves as a relationship between light and shadow. And the book puts together, very provocatively, old things and new things without any necessarily thematic content. Last thing I'm going to talk about, Eric said I've got 10 minutes, I'm going to be very quick. I'm just going to say, despite not being in Diploma 1, I seem bizarrely, fortuitously, to have ended up kind of building a Diploma 1 project or working on a Diploma 1 project in London. Eric once said to me he owes his entire career to the planning system, which I wholeheartedly concur with. It's because planners, the School of Architecture I went to at Liverpool had a school of planning, was called civic design. It's because we have planners who understand the deep background structure of city life, of front and back, public life, the more intimate aspects of life, that it's possible still to operate in the European city. It's very, very difficult because there's all sorts of capitalist and individualistic agencies at play as well. But in effect, as Dalibor pointed out to me, Victoria Street was called a street, even if it lacks any of the identifying foreground aspects of it. The background aspects of a cathedral, a train station, a theatre, various schools, houses of parliament, and etc., the representational structures of the United Kingdom at the other end of the street. And we've built some buildings, we're building some other buildings. It's a kind of non-master plan. Allies and Morrison had a go at it. They kind of dealt with mass and bulk and geometry. KPF had a go and they kind of dealt with it via geometry, I suppose. Expressive, but non-communicative. And yet what's kind of arisen is a series of people, about 10 different architects, something like a diploma studio. There's Chipperfield, there's PLP, who are part of KPF, there's Benson and Forsyth. Actually, there was a table, there was a conversation. Certain things still kind of worked. There was other agents involved, the planning department. The town hall is in the centre. This is a drawing of it as a series of rooms, horizons of involvement, as Peter would say. So the train station is a grand urban interior, the cathedral ditto, and the role that our library plays in this as a sequence of experiences. Trafalgar Square is a grand room. Also drew the interior of Christchurch Spitalfields. Oh, sorry, Freudian slip. St Martin's in the Fields. Bringing Eric into the conversation, as well as the guys that did the parks. And we've done a series of projects looking at the city as a series of rooms for the Parliament Square. Baldacchino outside the cathedral sadly won't be built. And then a library. I'm just going to finish on this. A library next to a theatre by Frank Matcham, next to a Georgian terrace with a pub in it. Housing in the middle, an office at the back, viewed from the forecourt of the train station. A south-facing facade of the library with the top floor being a public meeting room, the penultimate floor, cafe and restaurant. The building can operate in the evening when the library is closed. In fact, it needs to, because it needs to generate an income to pay for the staff. This is supposed to go on site in August, probably be a bit delayed. This is the housing. The last thing I'm going to say is I had a kind of spurious idea that one way to embed this civic institution into its context opposite quite a fine facade of a train station with niches and sculptures next to Frank Matcham's quite sensitive evocation of a theatre as a palazzo with sculptures, albeit of kind of golden ballerinas, was to refer to an ancient tradition, in this case the Muses, because they don't carry any religious or militaristic content like a lot of late 19th century public art does. This kind of gave us something like the idea of choral poetry being situated in relationship to the street, and Urania, the Muse of Astronomy, dealing with the sky. And we quite quickly realised, I remember Signe saying to me, putting sculptures on buildings, that's a big risk, and me going, yeah. And ultimately, it kind of dissolving into a series of paradigmatic situations, a grand stair that can operate as an amphitheatre for the children's library and for reading groups, connecting the ground floor to the first floor in the kind of typical way that you expect light to orient your movement through a building. And what I realised was that what one should do is work with other artists, because that invisible territory, which is kind of lost, was never really the domain of the architect on their own. The zone of ambiguity that Sotomayor talks of between stucco, sculptor, architecture, painting, was a space of dialogue. In this case, the public meeting room on the top floor, which can be available for the planning department, immediately claimed it at the planning committee. We're going to have our public meetings there. This is where we'll have the planning department, because City Hall is a kind of mute concrete tower. Situates you in relationship to the cathedral, the view of the river beyond, the evening sunlight, etc. And that in itself, the fact that people could recognise it and that it could operate as both room and part of the field of the city, is probably, I think, the kind of moment at which we reach silence in architecture.
Brilliant. Patrick, thank you. Just so much achieved and more to come. It takes me straight back to Gray's Inn Road and 1987, though I wasn't part of it, and those conversations about the street and so on. It's fantastic. So could we follow with William Mann, please?
I'm going to pick a bone and share a moment of failure. It was a rite of passage for students at Cambridge to engage with the Baroque. Obviously, you start off in your first year, and it's like, what's that? I see it a little bit as a kind of symbolic renunciation of Puritan England. But I have to say, and I did engage with it partly, but I would say my mistrust for the Baroque was never entirely dispelled. The Baroque was central to Dalibor's architectural thought. His lectures, his book, many late articles. But isn't its place in his thinking also an ambiguous one? Historically, he offered a detached appraisal, considering it a period of tension before an inevitable rupture. Yet at times, Dalibor would speak of Baroque architecture with a warmth and a reverence, as if it was a state of wholeness before the fall. This is the pulpit in Brussels Cathedral, a rather beautiful representation of the fall. Was this a hint of ambivalence or divided loyalties? Or were these perhaps differing positions, legacies of his contrasting tutors, the dissident Patočka or the conservative Sedlmayr? I didn't really expect to have to address this question or this ambivalence in architectural practice, but 25 years on, I found myself in a ruined monastery in Mechelen, in Flanders, in my hand, a rather cheerful and upbeat brief, a competition brief for a public library. So that's my studio, Witherford Watson Man, we dug deep. We drew on years of spiritual exercises at Cambridge, exploring topography, fragments, and bodily experience. And it was these exercises that enabled us to respond to this battered vestige of the 1660s as an unfinished journey, not as a dead artifact. In Flanders, the Baroque churches are not perfect choreographies of life or light. Let's face it, this is not Guarini, this is not Borromini, but rather the stones on which successive conflicts have scratched their marks. In Flanders, the Reformation was an uprising, and the Counter-Reformation was an act of imperial force. As Milan Kundera writes of Baroque Prague, the thousands of petrified saints gazing at you from all sides and threatening you are the frenzied occupation army that invaded 350 years ago. The Dominicans from Sertogenbosch migrated to Mechelen at the end of this 80-year conflict. They'd almost finished their church 130 years later when the French Revolution drove through and pushed the monks out on the street. The Revolutionary Army turned the monastery into a barracks and the church into a stable. When the Nazis used Mechelen as their railway hub for deporting the Jews of Antwerp, the Predikeren Klooster was their barracks. These waves of history left behind a sanctuary that was both incomplete and broken open. Only the core of the monastery survived, like a bloodied stump. Without its outbuildings, the monastery floats free in the city edge, disengaged from the streets around. The demolished caldarium that had stood at the northwest of the cloister was particularly interesting to us. It was the sociable heart of the monastery, the only rooms that were heated. We aimed to embed the library in the city with single cell extensions to northwest and southeast, so here and here. We called on the authority of the past to reverse the building's isolation. The monastery was a set of generous, austere rooms around a vaulted cloister, well suited to more active uses on the ground floor, and book stacks on the first. This is the cloister in the middle. Our caldarium was a stack of rooms for conversation, a cafe with meeting rooms above. We imagined the church as a mix of the everyday and the reflective. Newspapers, internet, and a lecture theatre at street level, and reading up in the vaults. Our enclosed lecture theatre was a kind of wooden ark moderating the vast stone barn into narthex, nave, apse, and aisles. At the Assamkirche in Munich, the ascension from mortal to immortal is through faith and ritual. In our library, the readers would hover between the cobbles and the powder blue bohemian vaults, poised between the unthinking continuity of the everyday and the heavenly ruins. The Dominicans were mendicants, urbanites, and above all, preachers. Our lecture theatre would have been a small wooden theatre for 150, oriented across the nave, as if to the pulpit, but enclosed for warmth and ease of hearing. A space for street and marketplace, but protected. Between the Holocaust Museum and the ruined church would be our turret of discourse, of civilized dispute and casual talk, a tapering, spiraling tower of brick, sinking roots and climbing laboriously towards the sky. Our project was neither an act of homage nor of revolt. We interpreted the monastery's topography, its horizontal and vertical journeys, and its ruptures for a new public. But the local jury considered our project a transgression, and we got precisely 0 points. Completeness in architecture shuts out time, even when dressed with prompts to participation, as of course throughout the Baroque. Perfection is a closed circle. The monarchs and the church of the 17th and 18th centuries had the power to finish what they started, and these perfect works have come down to us unaltered. At Würzburg, Zweifelten, the Belvedere Palace in Vienna, Melk, even Vaux-le-Vicomte or Blenheim. Unlike the sketchy, partial works left to us by the Renaissance or the tapestries of time that are the Gothic cathedrals. In the ruins of the Baroque, I found a way past that perfection that had shut me out. Broken open, I could hear echoes of antiquity, the Middle Ages, even the modern age. And the struggles and anxieties of the 17th century seemed to take on a universal resonance. According to Dalibor, the power of the fragment has its origin in the disintegration of the Baroque visual language. He was at his eloquent best, tracing the death of the Baroque he loved and the emergence of the modern condition he didn't entirely trust. This big bang at the origin of the modern world, whose echoes, thanks to Dalibor, we can still hear. Thank you.
Thank you, William, for a lament and at the same time celebration of your process. It was very lovely to see. So we're going to follow with the first of three figures who are architects, all, and have built. Rowan Moore.
Is this microphone symbolic or instrumental?
I think it's virtual, actually. Here we go. Yeah, okay. Here you go.
Also, Eric, I have no means of knowing how long I'm taking, so when I'm taking too long, do please tell me, because I know how annoying it is to talk too long. I was very struck by something William said in this morning's session, when he described how Dalibor almost never talked about contemporary or nearly contemporary architects in a slightly annoying way, but in a way which in retrospect was kind of liberating, because it gave us the sort of ability to go out and find ourselves, or sort of the freedom to do that. There were people like Scarpa and Louis Kahn or Snotzi, or maybe even kind of early Gehry, who you could say had some relevance to what Dalibor was talking about, but he never ever talked about them. So thank you for that insight. It's also something that always used to be, criticism always made of Dalibor is he's not keeping up with the times. He kind of got to Vienna in 1906, and then he stopped. And that was the accusation made in about 1985. In about 1995, one of Dalibor's most loyal followers said, no, it's not true. No, he sort of got into early Cubism. So in other words, he was in Paris, 1912. So in a decade, he'd moved 6 years forward. So that, you know, there's a bit of a problem there. But as we've said, or maybe there wasn't a problem, as, you know, that's discussed. But as Peter and others have said, Dalibor was actually sort of fantastically interested in the modern world, in bizarre experiments by NASA and so on. Also, in the architecture in the Age of Divided Representation, there's a kind of glorious absence of all the architects who flourished during the period in which Dalibor was writing it. You know, there's no Zaha, I don't think there's any Frank Gehry, etc. My career has been as a journalist, writing about architecture. And obviously, as a journalist, you are supposed to be dealing with the here and now, the immediate, what happened yesterday, what's going to happen tomorrow. And if it happened 2 days ago, then you can't write about it anymore. It's too far in the past. 2 pieces of writing I did in 1983 I want to mention. One is, Will had to do a course of lectures with Marcial Echenique about his view of sort of urban planning and so on, which, as you know, is sort of very geographically, economically based. And we all had to write an essay, and I didn't really know what to write. And Dalibor very mischievously got me to write an essay about Louis Aragon, Paris Peasant, Walter Benjamin, the Arcades, which unfortunately was marked by Marcial, so I got a 3rd. But it wasn't my greatest piece of writing, but it was better than that. I was also, at pretty much the same time, involved in the Limehouse project we've been talking about, which was related to a kind of political planning struggle about what would actually happen there in the early years of the sort of whole Docklands regeneration project. And I was motivated to propose and publish an article in The Spectator with a slight nepotistical nudge from my brother, who was employed at the time, which was published under the headline Colonel Seafoot's Village, which was my first published article. And that really was the way I ended up going. I've written in a number of places in the years since. I've done a few things also that are not journalism, but that is my main occupation. I now write for The Observer. And I've written some books, Why We Build, and just recently Slow Burn City, which is about contemporary London. And in fact opens in London Zoo. And it's interesting what David was saying about animals. And one of the sort of not so friendly comments I'm getting on this book is, why do you start in the zoo? And I don't know why exactly, but I do know, because it's because of Dalibor. Anyway, all through, I was a bit of an imperfect student of Dalibor's, because I was a bit too argumentative and sort of stubborn and not always as open as I should have been to what he had to offer, but I nonetheless got a great deal out of him. And he's always behind my elbow when I am writing. In fact, if you were to summarize my life's work in 3 words, I'd say it's Dalibor for dummies. It is how can I bridge that gap between the incredible things he said, his incredible depth of knowledge, and the sort of everyday quotidian struggles of architecture, development, planning in cities, especially British cities, especially London. And there's a few things that have been talked about by other people, which I think I should just repeat, though, as sort of things I got out of Dalibor that are highly relevant. One is the idea that architecture is a space, about spaces and not about objects. quite a lot of other architects have sort of got that by now, but it's nonetheless worth repeating. And of course, Dalibor had an incredibly rich sense of what a space is. It's not just a void between solid things, as Wendy was saying very eloquently just now. Also, that architecture is cultural, social, political. It doesn't exist on its own. And then the importance, as was said earlier, of the given reality of the city. A slow burn city is about London as it is now, and the concept of the slow burn city is that cities change by consuming and remaking themselves, but they don't do it by, or they ideally don't do it by completely destroying what's already there. It's a process of change at ideally a certain rate. And concomitant to that was all the things that architecture is not, or is not primarily, but is often considered to be by writers and architects. It's not primarily formal, it's not primarily aesthetic, technological, stylistic. And those are really kind of invaluable insights, especially for me, because before Dalibor, the kind of what I thought architecture and architectural history was kind of as handed down through people like Pevsner and Summerson, who were considerable figures, but they had, I would say, a rather narrow idea of what architecture was. I would say, the text I've written goes into this in a little bit more detail, but I think this view of architecture is now stronger in the world of writing about architecture than it has been for a very long time, certainly in the 30-plus years that I've been doing it. I think there are quite a lot of writers now who, in a different way, are working in this field of the interaction of architecture and culture, to use a shorthand word. Carolyn is putting it into practice in sort of bringing ideas into the very, very physical world of food. I mentioned some other writers, some of whom are absolutely not shaped by Dalibor, but are part of a kind of more general sort of, I think, growing understanding of this sort. Anna Minton, who writes sort of brilliantly about issues of sort of what is public. Journalists like Oliver Wainwright and Eddie Heathcote and Owen Hatherley are also engaging in different ways in these issues in a way in which writers of their kind were not 15, 20 years ago. I'd mention more sort of in the academic direction that the work that Mark Braley and Jane Klussik have done looking at the structure of the London area of Tottenham as in opposition to the kind of regeneration plans being put forward there. And they're talking about the sort of structure of the block that for me is very Daliborian. So I think there's all sorts of ideas disseminating out there directly and indirectly as a result of Dalibor. However, as I say in my text, there's ways in which he is very much not being listened to. I wrote it sitting in Patisserie Valerie in St Pancras Station, having just come back from Ebbsfleet, which is a place that George Osborne claims to be the site of a new garden city, and it absolutely isn't. It's a string of housing estates, developers' housing estates stuck together with access roads. I'd just written my tribute to Zaha Hadid, in which I had to sort of cite the, for me, sort of melancholy fact that her greatest sort of formal expression of her abilities was a cultural center in Azerbaijan essentially for a despot. So, and then I was sitting in Patisserie Valley. When we were students, we were always encouraged to do cafes and bookshops as being places where you could still get a little bit of wholeness. You could still have a sort of a small world where what Dalibor was interested in could happen. And since then, we've had Costa Coffee, we've had Borders, and then Borders has turned into Amazon. In other words, these sort of refuges of meaning have themselves been kind of commodified and pulled apart. And Patisserie Valerie originally was a single cafe in Soho of the kind that Dalibor was talking about, and now, of course, it's a chain, and this space I was sitting in really has lost all those qualities. So in other words, I was very much feeling sort of fragmentation of the contemporary world. If you go outside from that space, you see the King's Cross development, which I think has some learnings from what Dalibor was talking about, partly because people who studied under him have worked in some of the architectural practices involved. And Dalibor will be extremely critical of many aspects of that, but I think it has some rudiments of what he was talking about. I don't honestly know what's going to happen next. It doesn't look like a very auspicious time because it does seem like the forces of sort of market-driven commodification and fragmentation are more powerful than ever. However, there are a lot of people out there who, to a greater or more or less influenced by Dalibor, are exploring his thinking and are developing it. And all through today, I've been sort of thinking of more names, and I absolutely don't have an exhaustive list, but I think I just want to mention the people on this table for a start, including Eric. Eric's designing the tallest building in the City of London, so that's quite an achievement for Daliborism. There's people like Howard Tompkins, there's Sam Causer, there's 6A, there's the people who went off to work for people like Hopkins and Allies and Morrison. And then there are other architects who I think are, in different ways, dealing with some of the things Dalibor was talking about. David Chipperfield, Crusoe, St. John, Muff, Assemble. And I even mention, though I think Dalibor would shudder, people like Herzog and de Meuron and Rem Koolhaas, who are at least in the same sort of field of trying to understand what is meaning in the modern world. So as I say, I have no idea what is going to happen next, but I think the point is that Dalibor planted very, very many seeds which are going to grow in ways that we can't predict, and they are sort of more important than ever for the challenges that we all face. Thank you.
Thanks, Rowan. Fascinating. And sorry to cut you short, but anyway, on to Carolyn.
Did you cut me short?
I wasn't sure. Sorry. I knew this was going to happen. It's very moving to be here today. I think we're all part of an extraordinary legacy, and a man that not only showed us the horizons of a practice that maybe when we first thought we wanted to enter into it, we didn't really understand very well. Maybe, it was just like kind of bricks and mortar. And yet, I actually arrived in Cambridge in the same year as Dalibor in 78. And Peter, I should say, by the way, who's sitting there at the sort of silent centre of all of this. Very keen to be an architect, but as Rowan just said, very eloquently, not really knowing what that meant. And I encountered this kind of, and all of us did, and who arrived in that year, encountered this kind of, I said in my piece, it was like a sort of slow explosion going off. There was this incredible sense of something extraordinary having arrived in the hallowed halls of Cambridge, and it was foreign. and it was kind of passionate, and it was actually quite difficult to understand for quite a long time. But, I mean, I can tell you that Scroope Terrace in 1978, you know, there were kind of shabby corridors, and you would sort of go down and you would know that something was going on in, you know, the room at the end of the corridor. And where Dalibor was holding forth, there would be people literally sort of, it was a crit for the diploma or something, there would be people like me, you know, just eagerly squeezing in and trying to sort of eavesdrop on whatever this thing was. It was, as I say, sort of unintelligible to a lot of us for a very long time, what Dalibor actually was saying. But you just knew that there was this kind of power to it, and this extraordinary sense of possibility that you just try to grab onto as it was sort of unfolding in the room. And I mean, I haven't got them up here, but I have some of my notes from early lectures from Dalibor, and you would literally just scribble. I'm sure a lot of us in this room have been through the same experience. You would just scribble as fast as you can, sort of spelling Merleau-Ponty completely wrongly, hoping, you know, to sort of catch up later and look it all up later. And, you know, it's... And I think I knew right at the beginning, sorry, that it was going to take me a lifetime to catch up with this extraordinary gift that was being given to us. Now, somebody said earlier today, they didn't really know how Dalibor sort of got all that stuff crammed in his head. I mean, I think certain of us are born with brains the size of a planet, and Dalibor was one of them. And, you know, he sort of, the passion and the ideas just, which felt fully formed. That's the other interesting thing. I think when he came to Cambridge, there was an unfolding agenda that we sort of were just allowed to be party to, but it was already there in his head. And it was this question of how does one make meaning in a fragmented world? And of course, as we all know, he'd been through a very varied career himself. I mean, living through the Second World War and seeing terrible things as part of it. And yet had sort of come with this incredible soil, this culture that was just sort of embedded in him. And an idea that there was, you know, the project of humanity, as it were, had more going for it than might appear on the sort of the drab surfaces of 1970s England. And he certainly began to sort of open up those possibilities for us. And this is just an image of one of those fantastic tours, exhausting tours, I should say. I mean, Dalibor had the stamina of, I don't know, a kind of ox on steroids when it came to travelling around cities. He'd be sort of up at 8 o'clock in the morning. Breakfast was a cigarette and a coffee, and then you would be walking for sort of 16 hours, basically. But it was absolutely incredible to be part of those sorts of trips. Anyway, many people have said eloquently today how he opened up a whole realm for them, which you know, really gave them the sort of the strength and the inspiration to go on and explore architecture in their own way. And I think for me, it was that openness of his teaching, which has been mentioned many, many times today. An incredible generosity, actually, I would say. I mean, Dalibor was pretty much always the brightest person in any room he was in. Not always the most patient, but, you know, I mean, probably the brightest, probably the best informed, almost always the most passionate. And to receive all that was quite hard, you know. It took time. But then, as one sort of, well, actually, I also owe him, I should mention, on a personal note, the incredible honour of having been invited back here to teach with him, and that really was a huge moment in my life. But, you know, it was only sort of the maturity of going away and working out how to spell Merleau-Ponty and just letting those ideas gradually absorb into one's own work that actually what Dalibor was saying, it was almost like an urgency of getting all of this extraordinary passion for what human culture could be across to the dumb vessels that were the 17-year-olds he was kind of given to teach back in the 1970s. For me personally, I mean, I don't consider myself to be an academic, and I know one when I see one, and Dalibor definitely was a proper copper-bottomed academic. And I think one of the beautiful things about his teaching is that I would say many people in this room are not proper copper-bottomed. We have a few. We have Joseph, who's going to talk shortly. But, you know, most of us are not. Most of us are, relatively speaking, dumb animals compared to Dalibor. And yet, through practice, through design, through even just kind of living a life in a way that, as Rowan just said so eloquently, he made it very clear to us, you know, that there was something to be plumbed, and that just simply looking at the surface wasn't enough. So that courage to go deeper, and that excitement about trying to sort of, you know, peel up the layers of the visible and find something remarkable and extraordinary underneath. And it was the paradigmatic situation, as he described it, which perhaps resonated for me the most, because for some reason in my own life, I think my interest in architecture had always been more about our relationship with the built thing than with the built thing itself. So I could never remember, you know, whether the dentils were kind of the little bits above the parapet or not. I mean, I couldn't do that sort of naming of parts. But the sense that there was something really powerful to be discovered and explored in the fragmented world, as Dalibor called it, that was still so rich and powerful that it had the grace and beauty of a Greek temple. It was just manifested in a different way, was something that was very, very powerful for me in my own work. I would say it took me about, let's be accurate about this, 23 years and several months, to realise that what Dalibor had given me was permission to explore architecture in a way that wasn't necessarily about buildings. And I had an epiphanic moment when I realised that many of the things that he was talking about could be explored through food. I went to Rome, I did the scholarship there, and I studied a patch of the city around the Jewish ghetto and the theatre of Marcellus, which I've rather sort of clumsily 2 o'clock in the morning coloured in red there. Just looking at the way people were living in the city over 2,000 years and saying, how did they get up in the morning, how did they eat, how did they buy food, how did they die, how did they have sex, how did they wash, and so on. And it's extraordinary if you map the life of a city like that. I mean, particularly one like Rome, of course, which is the cliched palimpsest of palimpsests. But what really emerges and fascinated me, and in fact the word mundane came up, I think Bieber mentioned the word mundane earlier, and I sort of thought, isn't it interesting? Because for me, what really resonated was that the word mundane itself, which we think of as meaning dull and routine and everyday and so on, is actually derived from the Roman mundus. It actually means cosmic and worldly and universal. And that was an epiphany as well, because I thought actually the things that Dalibor was always talking about, the looking at the paradigmatic situation, I can't say paradigmatic if you notice, the paradigmatic situation, and letting that speak to you, letting the richness of what that means over a huge density of time, and letting that be the powerful thing that you can still respond to, really, really made sense to me. And so the mundane became my, I suppose, way of carrying on the extraordinary work of Dalibor without, as it were, necessarily being a phenomenologist per se, And I think exactly as Rowan said, this Dalibor for Dummies, this sort of idea that you absorbed the extraordinary scholarship and laser-like precision of Dalibor's thinking and are able to sort of let it resurface in your own work in a way that may not be as precise, but nevertheless has that deep soil of thought backing it up. That's what I feel he gave me. So, I mean, this is part of that study that I did. It's a butcher's shop occupying the theatre of Marcellus. Just the incredible sense of, these extraordinary buildings that were once very grand actually being re-inhabited by something as beautiful and as powerful as the buying and selling of meat. And of course this was on the site of the old Roman Forum Holatorium. So there's a lot of food themes running through this work in ways that I didn't particularly realise. I'm going to speed up. But you know, this is just part of the work that I've ended up doing, is really sort of trying to understand the everyday life of the city through the medium of food. These are sort of maps of London showing how the food was travelling in and how London was shaped by food. You know, the visceral city, you know, the fact that if food becomes your medium, you can actually start to blend together two sides of the architectural discourse that I think Dalibor was so eloquent at sort of telling us about, which was the human on the one hand and the built environment on the other, and how those things come together and how they speak. And we can feel them. And I think, you know, the fact that he was so good at interpreting these kinds of ideas through design was through the fact that a lot of these issues that he was trying to explore are non-verbal. They are actually things that simply are about life being lived and how that sort of gets embedded in the fabric of the city. And this is sort of, I wasn't thinking, I didn't know I was going to be here when I wrote this talk. So it's sort of, it was slightly meant to be slides just kind of carrying on while somebody read out what I'd written, so I won't, as it were, drag you through it. But I will say that this final image of Lorenzetti really sums up to me, I mean, the place that not only I've got to now, but I wouldn't have got to even remotely have begun, actually, if it wasn't for Dalibor, which is this idea that we do live in a world shaped by food, and that's actually a very powerful way of thinking about how a lot of the things that Dalibor talked about are connected. So Citopia simply means food place, and it's just a way of describing the world as shaped through food. I have to tell you one anecdote. I mean, it was interesting that Limehouse came up. I know Michael Mallinson, sitting at the back there, was very instrumental in getting us all involved in Limehouse. And again, to pick up on what Rowan said, you know, Dalibor was often accused of not really engaging in sort of the modern world and, you know, really preferring it all before the dreadful Descartes came along. But actually, he was passionately interested in certain aspects of the modern world, as Rowan said. But it was kind of all within his stride, you know, so thanks to Michael, a group of us had got very politicised about Limehouse, and I remember we suggested that we did some projects there, and we took him down to the basin and we were showing him round and ranting about the awful things that Seafoot was about to visit on the basin. And I was particularly exercised because I'd been involved that summer in the planning inquiry trying to stop Seafoot from seafootifying this amazing piece of old London dockland. And I remember Dalibor standing there and listening to me while I ranted and waved my arms around and said how dreadful it all was. And then he just nodded very quietly and said, "Still discovering the shit." And that was it. He kind of, you know, he was ahead of the game, as ever, with that, as with so many things. And I mean, since I'm now doing Dalibor impressions, the other thing I have to say, and maybe all of us also sort of go around saying this, when we're trying to work out whether something is worth the candle or not, in a very Daliborian tone, you know, if he was upset about something or actually if he was trying to question whether it really was on the money or not, as I'm sure a lot of you in the room know, he would always say, "Weiter Bozza." And I think Dalibor taught us all, "Weiter Bozza." He's a beautiful man.
Thanks, Carolyn, and particularly for being here. It's an amazing effort. Joseph, do you want to remain at your place or to speak?
No, I'll remain at the table. I really want to take up quite a lot of what Wendy said about the social sciences and the idea that space is an objectifiable thing, which is exactly what Dalibor, and to some extent I, were working against. But it's really the way in which he taught and the way in which he spoke is what made these ideas memorable. And I remember talking to somebody who had done our course at the University of Essex. He was actually a student at the then Poly. And I said to him, "How did you get into this?" And he said, "Well, you did an introductory talk, you and Dalibor, and I listened to Dalibor and I listened to you, and I couldn't understand a word what you said, but I thought that's exactly what I want to do." So, in spite of the obscurity of language, something must have come through. So this idea of the, as it were, non-object space is something that we very much share in common. It comes very much through what Wendy said, and perhaps even more in the other lectures we've heard. The idea that working in space, working with space, is something corporeal. And that's something which Dalibor managed to communicate, not only through his words, but through his presence in the city, through the way he guided people through the city, the way he guided people through ideas and through the urban volume. Over the years, we had our differences, of course, and it might be exemplified by an occasion many years ago when we were both having coffee, and Dalibor lit a cigarette, and I said to him, I thought, poor Dalibor, he can't taste the coffee through the tobacco. And he said, and I thought, poor Joseph, he can't really enjoy his coffee without the cigarette. So that was, in a way, the difference between us. But Dalibor's sensibility was something very peculiar, very specific to him, and which he found very easy to communicate. That was perhaps his greatest gift, the ability to communicate, to transmit his enthusiasm, to transmit his own vision of the city, and to transmit the ability to manipulate, to handle the physical objects which make up our environment. I think that's a gift which is given to all of us, more or less, and I think that's a gift for which we're all grateful. That's why we're here.
Thank you, Joseph, for that very succinct view. Fantastic. And we're going to follow now with Stephen Witherford and back, as it were, to the drawing board.
Okay, I'm going to start by thanking Christian Frost for helping me locate myself in the context of the studio. Under Peter's definition of the quality of students, I represent the lowest order of student who would go on to eventually employ the more talented ones and occasionally get to have a discussion with someone who is teaching, which is sort of the theme in this brief, emblematic project. I continue to struggle or to understand the things that Dalibor tried to teach. But it was certainly the case, having come from a different school of architecture to join Cambridge, and having made a very conscious effort to attempt to do that, that he did awaken lots of feelings which I certainly didn't want to ignore. And it took a long time to kind of understand and begin to digest these, and a lot of conversations with a lot of people in this room. But there was a kind of pivotal experience, almost, I guess, 10 years after leaving Cambridge, and working, I was working with Eric at the time, and I'd spent a little bit of time with David Durney in Rome, and it was a this recognition that you could easily live or work in a city for many years and not really know anything about it. And that generated an idea with someone who I'd studied with Peter, William Mann, who I didn't know very well at the time. I know him quite a lot better now. And we were both working in practices, and we said we'd just get up very early one morning each week in London, and we'd go and do a walk before we went into work. And it was incredible how the challenge of learning to look, to develop the confidence to trust what you're feeling, to find the tools to explore these, and to find the kind of words, the drawings, the kind of anchors to communicate these things with other people, which is sort of the basic job of an architect. It was in the new year of about, it was 2007, in Dalibor's study, fan heater blaring away, lots of smoke. I moved an ashtray and laid out a series of drawings of an area between this area, between effectively the River Thames at the top, Tate Modern, in its power station form, Blackfriars Road to the left, and Borough High Street on the right. We'd won an invited competition. Rowan, we should disclose now, was partly judging that, and possibly behind our win to some extent, great extent. I sort of took Dalibor through this. So he sort of was smoking. I was sort of very excitedly explaining all these sort of things we'd come across, the evolution of these edges over the different period of time and their increasing speed. And he's like, This sort of polite irritability. Let's see if this works. I talked to him about the sort of these kind of conditions we'd observed. We spent ages walking, making very different kinds of drawings. We deliberately didn't make any plan drawings. It wasn't a mapping exercise in the conventional sense. We'd identified places where people had come together who didn't necessarily know one another, these sort of casual encounters, markets, schools, cathedral, parks, museum. We kept going on. We looked at ways we'd explored kind of how we'd respond to some of these very kind of odd, quirky places that had simply resisted being kind of cleared, awkward, accidental kind of accumulations of things that happen all around us in cities, and reimagine those as a kind of way where people might read, play a game, hold a party, play some music. You went on. And the kind of synthesis of this, I'm not sure that's going to read very well, into a kind of a framework for Bankside under this kind of metaphor as a sort of imagined urban forest. And Dalibor was sort of semi-interested, listened through this, had another cigarette, and then in this kind of moment of incredible precision, he just said, "So what you're talking about is the urban interior." Right. And the key, I think, to one of the things that I didn't really appreciate at all as a student and for a number of years after was just really the why to bother or what is at stake, and how that would potentially inform kind of a practice. But Dalibor's sort of summary of the project was that you've done as much as we can do, simply increasing the opportunities for sharing. So we'd set out a rather ambiguous and indeterminate framework for how a place could evolve incrementally through negotiation. And after 10 years, it carries on through a series of incremental projects, some public funded, some private. During the course of this, and the many tank traps Patrick's alluded to, that one simply has to negotiate to do anything, whether it's rubbish or half decent, in the kind of, particularly in terms of public space, or as London would call it, currently public space. We had to go and present to the mayor's then advisor on architecture, Richard Rogers. And he kind of looked at these drawings and he said, they're very vague. And he kind of said, I kind of like it. He said, but it's very problematic. He said, at least with an axis, you know you can plant the trees at 6 metre centres. That's the truth. So over subsequent years of discussions in Dalibor's flat, what became more and more apparent, and I think this is really the thing that, I say this with a degree of surprise, which he may be offended by, we'll see, was Dalibor's total belief in the joy of life and casual encounters and the possibility embodied within the city for it to be reimagined in ways that would be conducive to supporting this. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Well, we have one final in absentia, and I will speak to Homer Farjadi's submission. If I can find the words, that is. I think this is particularly apposite as I look for this, because on the back of Thanasi's of Architecture and Continuity, the cover of which you saw this morning, drawn by Athanasios Panameridis. Oh, thank you. That's so good. Calliope. Is a mysterious little image of a house, a tower, and it was Homer's drawing, I believe, from the Diploma 1 studio of 1977 to 78. And it sort of remained as an amazing presence, drawn in biro. And of course, Homer has gone on to both build and to draw, and to continue to be remarkably creative. So in her absence, diffuse digital. Dalibor's interest in complexities of representation in drawings, architectural or otherwise, engaged many of us working with him in the studio. At the time in the late 70s and 80s, whether in sketches or measured drawings, they were hand-drawn. Authority of the hand-mind, correspondence, analytic, cognitive, or expressive subject, overlap, consideration of process traces, mapping, or construction documents were often discussed. I hope this set of drawings offered might have interested him in their representation of our continued practice engaged with digital design. There isn't a sequence, so Wendy, perhaps specific to the text, so perhaps you can use that, or I can do this. Hang on. Right. In the representation process, often project documents are organized in sets according to their potential coherences in the project, generally divided up and analyzed to reconstitute what was done or said during the project's formation. Diagrams or drawings tend to emphasize an inevitable fit between the original ideas and the final result, ensuring a linear continuity. In this process, authority of the original intention often takes strong precedence over contingent conditions. Digital design's contribution to this process often helps tightening of the logical screw. The capacity to map sites with seemingly endless scale of precision, matching scales of 1 to 10,000 with that of 1 to 10, or anything beyond or in between. The idea of particular scaled view seems to suggest a random choice. The building landscape, this isn't functioning, sorry. Yeah, the building landscape, territory, city to assume important fits and correspondences. And yet we know that a city, as much as territory, is more than a self-organizing entity. It is something that has strata, different levels, things underneath it that can be excavated, may be got lost, may be revealed. Its history is accumulated and replicating in scales of their recognition similarly specific. Slavoj Žižek refers to this process of recollection and mapping as a misrecognition, whereby projects contain a sentiment of longing as much as a wish to make things fit into such reasonable processes as projection of a certain melancholic loss embedded in the object's form before its time. Matter Clark called it mathématique sensible, against Corbusier's mathématique raisonnable, translation for which both rational or reasonable would do here. The set of drawings presented here, however, belong to a moment in the production of design that record the work of reasoned requirement in conjunction with hesitant schemas and diffuse realities that tend to trace conjunction of discontinuous subject positions in the drawings. They are found, edited moments extracted from the universal model to capture a specific set of spatial relations. This may be our version of digital mathématique sensible. As such, they could be said to describe a general history of dispersion, a dispersion of reasoned logic and sensible longing in the project mapping buildings in their morphological relation to the constructed landscape formation. Hovering between shifting trajectories of potential affiliations with buildings and landscape, with changing degrees of focus or liveliness in the design direction, are those lines that delineate simultaneous lines of thought and formulate conflicting and conjectural topics in specific places and forms of the project. The drawings here belong to a master plan proposed for the Madrid Campus of Justice Design competition prepared by Farjadi Architects in 2004. The 2D drawings are situated within a 3D digital model that delineates configurations of the landscape, the cityscape, and the project buildings together. They are arrested moments of the model, which in their specific 2D map seek to find specific design strategies that formulate the parameters for at once recollecting the found landscape of the existing hills on the site as horizons of its natural formation, and to plan a new campus that accommodates the extended city for the new complex of courts and administrative buildings. Lines here are the primary tool to establish limits in surface and volume, as well as accumulations which produce textural surfaces. As such, lines are not simply edges of volumes, but define strategic horizons, project datums, which establish degrees of embedding or separation, weight, lightness, and balance between buildings and landscape forms in their strategies for grounding, intersection, degrees of formal integration, or distance. Lines also resist distinction and separation of buildings from landscape, and as such create a continuous surface with an undefined morphology hovering between natural and constructed forms, between rectilinear and pleated edges. The drawings are therefore arrested moments of relational positions, stoppages that do not focus on object definition in rendered realities, but map relational strategies in the three-dimensional flux. Color codes in the digital model simply identify categories of landscape and city buildings. Lines are black over white background, reversible to white over black when seen from inside volumes, or below ground as specified by the digital program. Three-dimensional view treats below ground and above ground as continuous, where trajectories of volumetric or surface continuities are marked. Beige or orange surfaces are not surface notations, but are produced by accumulated lines, coded as sight, when seen at lower angles of incidence to the ground. Scale and distance are embedded in the three-dimensional base model and can be perceived as near, middle, or far, or degrees of high, low, below point of view. The precision of the three-dimensional construct has an identical relation to the found constructed form of landscape and the new construct of the campus city building to produce a new found form. They describe new matrices of entry datums in the potential intersections between building and landscape, construct embedded buildings or artificial hills, delineate skylines, distance between buildings, or simply creases in the form of the building landscape surface. As such, the two-dimensional drawings are at once precise construction documents as much as abstractions that describe degrees of reality that the project transfers to the final design. They are not diagrams of prescribed precision, but project an architecture constructed following digital trajectories that diagram its potentials for diffusion. Thank you, Sima. No, Homa. Yeah. And with that, we conclude and open to questions. And thank you for not interrupting, though you were invited to do so. This session, before taking tea, and then we will come back rapidly thereafter to respond, we hope, to a dialogue based on session 2 and beyond. But could we open the floor to questions? Richard. Yeah. And could you make yourself known? Yes, it's coming, it's coming.
This is a bit rhetorical. My name is Richard Wentworth, and I'm the arch interloper here. But what I really loved about the way that everybody spoke was, well, actually, you'll have to respect this, Joseph, the young. That everybody spoke about not understanding what they were doing. And I thought, you know, you come from King's Cross, you get out at Cambridge Station. There's a very definite emotion on that road, especially if you were never a student here. And I really like the idea that nobody knows what they're doing. And I think it's very stimulating to have grown-ups talk about the condition of puzzlement and fuddledness, which is of such long-term consequence. So I think that's not a question, but somebody could respond to what I've said.
And, you know, I think a lot of people have spoken today about the sort of the open-endedness of Dalibor's teaching. I mean, it was just one very, very articulate, long question that he was asking. And that is an amazing gift, to be given permission to ask questions. I mean, I think that's what I feel he gave me most of all. And I think the sense that there's always an answer lying just beyond what you can see, so you have to keep trying and you have to keep following, is really the energy and the passion that's in this room. And it's also the energy and the passion that he sort of has left behind him. It almost does, for me, sum up actually the difference between, you know, the geometry that allows you to know where to plant your trees and, you know, a life worth exploring and living. So that's beautiful. Thank you very much.
It'd be interesting to wonder to what extent Dalibor didn't know what he was doing, or thought he didn't know what he was doing. I have no idea what the answer is. I just put the question out there.
It's really just a very small addition to that, that particularly when Carolyn was talking and Stevie about not understanding. Closer to my mouth, okay. I certainly didn't understand a word of it for many years and still don't, but I always knew I'd got something out of it because I could cycle home in half the time that it usually took me to cycle home after a Dalibor lecture, so there was something in there. And I was thinking, in our session there was this issue of Thanassi saying that Dalibor couldn't draw, and then everybody else saying that he drew absolutely brilliantly. And I think both are true. And I think it's the same thing. I think it's... he both couldn't draw and could draw. He was both extremely articulate and wasn't. And it was that combination that was so absolutely fundamental to us each engaging with it for ourselves.
Just talking about not understanding, I have some lecture notes in which I talk about the Jan Battista Vico comes up quite a lot. Vico. And I couldn't really understand, I think it was about Gothic architecture, I couldn't really understand the connection between Vico and Gothic architecture. Actually, Dalibor was saying vehicle. So that didn't help the understanding either, but, I survived.
I just wanted to respond to what Rowan just said about whether or not Dalibor understood or thought he understood. I think that's really, really interesting. And I think, again, rather echoing Diana, it's a bit of both. I think he knew absolutely what the questions were, and I think he knew the territory amazingly, but I think he really did genuinely see what he was doing in the studio as an ongoing experiment. And that was what was so beautiful and powerful about being part of that process with him. Is it wasn't like, if you do this hard enough, kids, you'll get it. Yeah. I mean, it really was genuine open inquiry.
Well, it's a classic case of the more you know you don't know.
Exactly.
And,
it's Socrates.
Dalibor knew more than almost anyone, but... Yeah.
Exactly.
Just because of the way you're talking, I think that the other thing that comes out of that, which this is really for lesser mortals, I think students have got absolutely no idea whatsoever of how terrified the teachers are. So, what is it that you've, inverted commas, got to give? What if you're doing the "what do I know" thing, then you're probably not profoundly confident. And there's a fantastic tension in that, and it's hardly ever discussed. Of course, that's exactly what happens when you leave Cambridge railway station. I became about 3 inches high in 300 yards, because I think everybody knows.
Yeah, I think this business of the doctor ignorantia, talk about being ignorant, as a vehicle of investigation that Richard has raised is really interesting, not only for the creativity in a studio, but much more politically. How does a block defend itself against, a developer with this seamless project with a little red line, a budget, and, tax returns into the borough? If the creativity is coming from the doctor ignorantia, i.e. you learn through experience and all these, and there just isn't time for it, how, I'm interested to hear from the people practicing how you make an argument that slows it down, that I know Stevie and William work quite hard at getting a much longer dialogue going with the client for reasons just like this, i.e. it isn't about instant gratification, it isn't about form, blah, blah, blah.
I suppose I would suggest I'll answer that rather obliquely. I mean, it strikes me when I look at the student work that we produced and our peers produced, the kind of complexity that we aspired to kind of create and support is practically impossible to realise. And I wonder if it's desirable to realise, because the conditions of omnipotence and, I don't know, the capitalisation you'd have to reach to realise projects of a scale and complexity, I think would throw the enterprise into doubt. I suppose what we did explore in the studio, and what I called the kind of spiritual exercises, was this relation between architecture and the city.
I mean, it strikes me as interesting that the architecture in the city, it was kind of present. It was always, they were interwoven in the lectures we received, but certainly in terms of Dalibor's articles and writing, it was the architectural expression that got a kind of stronger expression. And I suppose in that sense, maybe there was a relation of, I feel like there's sort of knowledge, this kind of diagnosis that kind of covered the past, and then this kind of fertile gap that is the present, that was really the vehicle, really the kind of territory of the studio. My reflection after, I suppose, building some rather big and ugly sort of large cultural buildings, and then sort of waiting for kind of like 10 years while the kind of financial management of the concert hall kind of learns to speak to the artistic director, and, you know, building a culture is phenomenally hard. Building buildings is actually, you know, is what I call straightforwardly difficult. In the concert hall I built with Robrecht and Dam, it's on sort of 800,000 tons on steel springs to isolate it from a car park. But so what? You know, it's actually building a culture, embedding a classical music and opera and dance in a city that has had no public culture for centuries. That's the hard bit. And that's where it strikes me that the kind of, both this kind of combination of complexity and, in a way, inheritance, this culture that you inherit, that the organizations we've built for, I mean, you're right that kind of we try and stall projects for as long as possible. You know, you get appointed to do a master plan or an urban study, and then they sort of want it, and, you know, they're like, within a month they're asking for it. It's like, so we've developed various stalling tactics. Usually, when you get into kind of condition of complexity, the process stalls itself, and you've got plenty of time to actually inform yourself. But the clients who we've worked for over the last kind of decade, there are kind of organisations like the Whitechapel Gallery, who were established sort of, founded in 1901, but even sort of goes back to the 1880s. Amnesty International, about 55 years old. When we've worked for young institutions, you really feel the strain of them trying to fill this kind of void, and you just think the biggest curse we could bestow on them would be to build a big new building and sort of let them rattle about in it and sort of fight each other to find it. So in that sense, in terms of the complexity and the sort of slowness of what we're dealing with, it seems to me that actually in adaptation, in transformation, in these sort of what Rowan calls slow burn organizations, you know, it's like each iteration of one of these institutions is very hard fought, very hard won, and takes kind of decades and centuries. I'd see the kind of opportunity and, in a way, the kind of territory of both resistance, you know, how our kind of urban block thinks and how our culture accumulates, is precisely through that accumulation, metamorphosis of a kind of urban structure.
I think the breakouts are very useful for people who haven't seen each other for a long time to meet. But if we could make this one, which is coffee and tea, reasonably swift, then we can come back and have a ordered kind of end of question and answer, and then we'll break out once more. So a brief pause.
Thank you.